Hello and welcome back to Hypatia's Lantern. I hope you've all had a good new year. A bit of a change in format here today, a more nebulous discussion about whether there is a tangible difference between fascism and Nazism, and of course, why it's important. I'm going to avoid using too many pictures on this one. I'd rather not put pictures of fascists and Nazis and what they do if it can be avoided. Nazism and fascism tend to be used quite interchangeably. Most people won't really distinguish when using the term, and it comes down to how hard they want to push the button with people. Is there an actual difference, or are they the same? Fascism is an ideology born in the mid to late 1800s and progressed rapidly in Italy and Germany during the Great Depression. It also found many followers in Spain, in the United Kingdom, and in the United States. Crucially, it only really came to power in Italy with the National Fascist Party and Mussolini, Nazism and Hitler in Germany, and depending on who you talk to, Franco in Spain. It is a revolutionary movement wedded to anti-leftism, an amalgamation of the state and business towards one singular purpose, the success and independence of the nation through the lens of the mythical leader, as we've discussed previously on my video on fascism. Nazism, or the National Socialist Workers' Party, was a party born of the amalgamation of fascism and the Volkisch movement, with appropriation of socialist policies, but not principles, towards the success of the German people. The Volkisch movement being a movement developed on from the Romantic period of the late 1800s that centred around the creation of a shared identity of German peoples who shared a common language and a common identity that transcends borders, often around the idea of a victorious Germania, militaristic and standing above other nations. In addition to this, to be of the Volk, you had to, at the very least, be white. There's obviously a lot of crossover, but one key distinction is their end goal. The end goal of a fascist is to have a strong, militaristic state where every single individual is suborned to the greater good of the nation. Everything is and must be for the fatherland, and it is always the fatherland because it is masculine, paternal, and strong. Society is rigidly ordered and traditional gender roles enforced. It is the harsh, unthinking, unfeeling side of utilitarianism taken to an extreme. All resistance must be crushed, all opposition must be crushed. The end goal of Nazism, however, has all of those things and one key addition: a strict, ordered, and supreme racial hierarchy. Now, I can hear many of you say that fascism is inherently racist, and yes it is, but the end goal isn't a white ethno-state. It is often a byproduct, but it isn't an end in of itself. Fascism always needs an in-group and an out-group, and it is true that the out-group is often an ethnic minority, but it isn't the rule that the ethnic minority must be the out-group. Whereas with Nazism, the strict racial hierarchy means that the ethnic minority must always be the out-group. They can never be a part of the nation, and this is the biggest and boldest distinction. So when Richard Spencer or Lauren Southern or Gavin McInnes talk about white ethno-state, when they talk about a homeland for whites, they're not being just fascist. They're walking knowingly into neo-Nazism. And the reason I tie this concept of a white ethno-state into Nazism is not only because the language is incredibly, eerily similar, it is also because of the ideological underpinnings of the idea itself. When we talk about a homeland for a people, we talk about a homeland for a nation. A nation is defined as a group of people with a shared identity, cultural practices, and often their own language. For example, the United Kingdom is composed of several nations that are tied together in a single country. Often, the sense of a nation does correlate to ethnic groups, but it is not the sole point of their sense of nation, except in incredibly rare circumstances. White is just a skin colour. It does not have any of the characteristics to make a nation. White does not equal shared customs, language, ideas, beliefs, traditions, and cultural aspects, and so on. It's like saying that all of the people of Southeast Asia should unite under a brown ethno-state. Despite the entangled history between the subcontinent and further afield in places like Nepal or Cambodia, they're all separate and distinct nations. Them being brown isn't a commonality around which to coalesce, it's just that they are. So to say a white ethno-state, you are in effect saying that your whiteness is what unites you, your whiteness is what defines you, and your whiteness determines your position in this society. There are no other shared concepts, for example. Someone white from Wanaka, New Zealand has very little in common in terms of shared cultural concepts with someone white from Glencoe in Scotland. This doesn't make a nation. It becomes even more absurd when you factor in that, despite the correlation, ethnicity is not tied to a nation. I can be black and be British. I can be white and Zambian. I can be ethnically Chinese and still be Indian, or Russian, or any other combination, because the ethnicity is not a key component for the most part. Without that shared cultural heritage, without that shared concept of identity, it all falls apart like a fragile house of cards. It's a logical inconsistency at odds with every understanding of what a nation is. At this point, the neo-Nazi will try to say that the whiteness is a shared cultural heritage, that the white nations of the Western world are the inheritors of a shared cultural legacy that stretches from Socrates' musings in Athens to Galileo and the Enlightenment to today and our belief in what they call Judeo-Christian values. And whilst I'll go into a deeper dive on the concept of the West in another video, let it suffice to say that the Abrahamic faiths, that is, Judaism, Christianity and Islam, are all desert faiths of the Middle East, and that most of ancient Greece came to us through Arabic, as it was the Middle Eastern libraries that preserved, translated and then developed these texts. The Renaissance would not have been possible without Arab scholars. The concept also attempts to draw an unbroken line from Socrates and the city-states of Greece to our society today, which simply cannot be done. What we consider staple rights would have been unthinkable, and what they consider staple values would have been unconscionable. It's a fanfiction attempt at history. Unless the key goal underpinning the whole concept is to create a shared nation on the virtue of whiteness, about the whiteness, and focus just on the whiteness. But then that's the creation of a strict racial hierarchy, isn't it? And what was that about Nazis? Oh, they want to create a strict racial hierarchy. Funny that, isn't it? Now that we've established that the ethno-state is neo-Nazi, does it also follow that it is fascist? Yes and no. As we've previously discussed, fascism is incredibly agile. It is very good at morphing to prevent its destruction, so when people like Lauren Southern talk of the nice fluffy side of an ethno-state, I have no doubt that she believes that it is a democratic entity that is for the people, by the people, and of the people, with the people being white. And that's hard to classify as fascist, because fascism is nearly always totalitarian, it is nearly always aggressive in its control, and that doesn't necessarily fit in with the idea of a democratic state. However, simply having elections doesn't mean that a state isn't fascist. If the constitution of such a state disavows the populace and creates that racial hierarchy, it preserves the appearance of a democracy, whereas in reality it is anything but. For example, apartheid South Africa. It had all of the trappings of a democracy and so on, but the majority of the populace were disenfranchised. Was this a democracy or was this something else? Look up the Herrenvolk, it fits it to a T. This can be transposed to fascism. If the ruling party disenfranchises the undesirables whilst keeping the appearance of a democracy, is it truly a democracy any longer? I would argue that no, it is not. So when you hear people like Lauren Southern talking about their ethno-state, they're talking about creating a fascist state, a neo-Nazi state. There is a question here, and it comes to me from what this video was originally going to be about, in that, is Trump a fascist or a Nazi? Trump lost the election before I could get round to creating this video, and isn't as relevant as he used to be for these purposes. However, it does pose an interesting question. We've identified here that one of the main distinguishing points between fascism and Nazism is the creation and enforcement of a strict racial hierarchy. But how is that different from plain old racism? We know that Trump is a good old-fashioned American racist. If it holds true that he has many fascist traits, and he does this point then make him a Nazi? I would argue not, because nothing Trump has done or said so far, to my knowledge, is about the creation of a strict racial hierarchy, and I believe that need for a strict and defined racial hierarchy is what is the key issue. It is one thing to be a racist and to believe that people are lesser because of the colour of their skin, and it is entirely different to sit down and create an entire system of deliberate discrimination and classification with the explicit purpose of excluding those who are not white and ranking those who are based on their desirable characteristics. By that metric, I believe that it is right to say that Trump is a wannabe fascist, and prior to the election, I'd have said that if he were to win, this would be when the fascism really starts to come out. However, he lost, and though the United States' problems are nowhere near over, they can at least stop starting fires. It would be prescient to say that all Nazism is fascist, but not all fascism is Nazism. But why does this even matter? Is there a tangible difference? In some ways it's like asking, is there a difference between pig shit and horse shit? Yes, but at the end of the day it is still shit. The labels we use do matter, because our response is dictated by that label. So often, if we say someone is being racist, we have a visceral reaction to it. If we say someone is being Nazi, like not as a joke but an honest-to-God complaint, we react with outrage and horror, or we used to. The label does matter, because dealing with fascism requires a different mindset to dealing with Nazism. That difference in end goal, that difference around the strict racial hierarchy means that the arguments that you can best deploy against fascism won't necessarily have the same impact against the Nazi and vice versa. Knowing what we are dealing with is the first step towards actively combating it and eventually removing it from civilized society. And that's what this ramble is about, knowing to recognise what it is you're dealing with. I've been watching YouTube for a long time, and studying politics for even longer. I've seen many people who wouldn't ordinarily espouse racism, or sexism, or homophobia, or any other vile ideology fall into them because they've been exposed to them in a place where they did not expect these arguments in a manner in which they didn't recognise what they were hearing. That isn't to say people are stupid or daft, it's to say that when your guard is down with people you're having a good time with, it can be very easy for some malicious people to take advantage of that. After all, it's just a joke. Why are you getting so mad? It's just a joke. And yes, sometimes it is just a joke. When playing online or with friends or even friends of friends, it's really easy to just let loose and let your dark humour out. I've done the same when playing Crusader Kings or Europa Universalis, or perhaps in other games like Infamous, where you have a choice between good and bad options. You laugh and make jokes about the bad options. But when it's persistent, and it starts to become more than a joke, it's important you're equipped with the tools and knowledge to see what it is that you're being confronted by. What is motivating the ideas that are being put forward before you? Is this person spouting a half-baked argument that Jordan Peterson made? Is this person copying language from Tommy Robinson or Richard Spencer? Or perhaps are they repeating things that they've heard from Stephen Crowder or our favourite wannabe Mesopotamian, Sargon? Or have they seen some misrepresented statistics on Facebook and are drawing a non-factual conclusion? And this is the thing, it's hard to tell. It really is. Often the arguments the right uses sound disturbingly logical, like, if black people didn't commit the majority of crime, they wouldn't be exposed to police officers, and therefore the chance of escalating violence so often. If Muslims didn't commit the majority of terrorism, they wouldn't get profiled so often. If gays weren't so aggressive about their sexuality, they wouldn't be attacked so often. If women were more modest, they wouldn't face sexual assault so often. It's always framed in a painfully logical way, in a manner where they always want to appear apologetic, reluctant even. But this knowledge is their difficult burden to share. The police aren't racist, it's because so many black people commit crimes. Yet, when we look at the facts, we see that white people who commit the same crime with the same record get away with a lesser sentence. We see deep studies that show the recognised racial bias. We see a lot of evidence that demonstrates that the intersection between systemic racism, historical legacies, and current police brutality is not nearly as clear-cut as the right attempts to make it. The world, like a masterpiece Renaissance painting, is built upon hundreds, if not thousands, of layers. Connecting those layers to create that picture is not easy, nor something that can be done by throwing a few specks onto a canvas. It takes time and effort, and the right always likes to portray a simple solution to what they say is a simple problem. Take a moment to peel back the layers, however, and you see pretty quickly that rarely is the problem simple, and even more rarely is the solution simple. And that knowledge, that understanding of the world we live in, of the situation and lived reality of so many people, is extremely important because it governs our choices, who we vote for, who we have sympathy for, who we support, and that is the core of human society. So recognise when someone has simply gone too far on a joke or are being actually fascist or Nazi is important because it determines our choices in combating those ideologies. We have to be able to step up in these instances, and we can only do it if we recognise what we are dealing with. Otherwise, they'll run right round us and recruit followers, and we really don't ever want to be playing catch-up with fascists and Nazis. On that note, here is where we wrap up for the week. I hope you found this interesting. As ever, I'd love to see your thoughts in the comment section, and hopefully I'll have you back next week for a long overdue look at democracy. Thank you and goodbye.